Hello and welcome to Coffee Theology. Today I'm talking to Paul and we're talking about suffering. So Paul, first question, quite a big question. Did God create suffering?
Wow, you'd like to start with a hard one? The answer is no, he didn't. So we have to go back to the beginning in Genesis. So for me, Genesis, the first 10 chapters of Genesis are really important. In lots and lots of ways of understanding your Christian faith. Okay. But when we're looking at the question of suffering, it becomes really important that we look at what actually God did in those first few chapters of Genesis. And the Bible's quite clear. It says, in the beginning, God creates. And during each day of creation, at the end of it says quite clearly, and God saw that it was good. Okay?
Yeah.
So everything that God created was good, and it reached his high standard of goodness. All right. So in that, there's no room for believing that God created suffering.
Okay.
Because God creates everything good. However, the introduction of sin into the world through Satan and Adam and Eve, and the story of how they're tempted into sin, the subsequent or the consequence of that is that God then says to Adam and Eve that they have to leave the garden, and that he curses the ground that they're working on, and he tells the woman that she's going to have a tough time through childbirth, and he tells Adam that the serpent or the snake is going to be continually snapping at his heel. And the consequence of that is that as they leave the garden, sin enters the world, and suffering and sickness enters with it as well. The world, the earth, effectively, according to Genesis, becomes sick and starts its process of dying. And Adam and Eve, although they live for quite a period of time, they have children, Cain, Abel and Seth. But even in that, the story of Cain and Abel, the murdering of a brother, sin is already in the world, and suffering comes as a result of sin.
Yeah.
So God creates everything that's good. It's sin that introduces suffering into the world. And no matter what our sin is, it will produce suffering. So I think the Bible's really quite clear that post the Garden of Eden, human sin creates human suffering, and the start of decaying of the world introduces natural suffering.
Okay.
Neither of which were God's intentions. Now, did God create suffering? I've already said no. But if you then look at the last two chapters of Revelation, you see God's ultimate answer to the question of suffering. Okay, because the first few chapters of Genesis, everything's undone through sin. But in the last two chapters of Revelation, everything is conquered over sin. So the sin that we do ourselves, which creates suffering, is dealt with at the end of Revelation. And the natural order of decay is changed into the new heaven and the new earth. Okay. Now, Paul references that in Romans, where he says that all creation's waiting for the sons of God to take their place. It's groaning in anticipation.
Yeah.
And Revelation brings it all around, the whole full circle around, and says actually what God does in the end of Revelation is good according to his standard of good. Okay, everything is renewed. All sin, suffering, death, tears, illness is taken away.
Yeah.
It says there's no more of that. And it says also that the heavens and the earth are renewed. Okay. And that takes away the natural decay and therefore suffering from the world. Okay.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So God doesn't create suffering. Sin introduces suffering on every scale, in every way. And God, at the end, shows us how he's going to deal with it right at the end times.
Yeah.
Now, that process of change starts at the point of the cross. Okay?
Great.
So at the cross, God is dealing with suffering at its most desperate, both in terms of sin and the result of suffering, and in terms of the decay of the earth in terms of suffering. God is showing at the cross, I've dealt with this, and He's moving, and we're looking now towards Revelation and what's going to happen.
Awesome.
Yeah?
Great. So how does God deal with suffering today?
Well, I think I've just painted a picture there of the beginning and the end of the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, and in the middle, the cross. So, at the cross, the kingdom comes. Now, when Jesus arrives on earth as a baby, the kingdom is starting to come. And as Jesus is doing his ministry around Israel, as it was then, he's bringing the kingdom. Every time he does something, or every time he says something, he says, the kingdom's coming, the kingdom's coming, the kingdom's... Or he says, the kingdom's here, the kingdom's here, the kingdom's here. And how does Jesus deal with it? Well, he deals with it by, first of all, identifying with people's suffering. So if you take the story of Lazarus dying and the two sisters, Mary and Martha. Very interesting is that they send the messenger to Jesus, and it takes him 2 days to get from where he is to where Lazarus has died. Now that's quite a long time in terms of the death process, because by then Lazarus would have been anointed, he would have been wrapped up in cloth, and he would have been put in a grave, because in the Middle East at that time, somebody dies, you have to bury them fast.
Yeah.
Okay. But Jesus comes and he identifies with the suffering of the two sisters.
Yeah.
It says it, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Okay, he stands there and he weeps. He identifies with human suffering. Now, it's not like I'm saying, oh, I feel empathy towards you. What the Bible's describing is Jesus' deep grief for the death of a friend.
Yeah.
Okay, and he weeps. So first of all, he's identifying with suffering. Secondly, he then does something about it. He calls Lazarus out of the grave and resurrects him from the dead. Now, we see that time and time again, Jesus doing miracles to ease people's suffering.
Yeah.
But it's not everybody everywhere. Okay, it's where Jesus is at that time. We see Jesus being moved with compassion. We see Jesus identifying with people. We see Jesus touching the lepers. Now the lepers would have been probably amongst the most suffering people because they're untouchable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're sent out from the city. But Jesus sits with them. He talks to them. He heals them. And you see that all through his ministry. And then you see in the early church, in Acts, you see James and Peter John and Peter going to the temple to worship, and they see a man that's suffering, and he asks for money, and they don't give him money, they give him healing.
Yeah. Okay,
and so on and so forth. But again, that's not all around the world all at once. That's where the disciples were at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we go through the early church, you see people like Bede, up in the northeast of England, praying, and mighty miracles happening. Okay, and then you get all the way through until we get to today. So how does God deal with suffering today? Well, first of all, he asks us to identify with people's suffering, just like Jesus did.
Yeah.
So we're not apart from it. We're not divorced from suffering as a Christian. So I become a Christian and suddenly everything's going to be okay. I've got perfect health and no suffering for the rest of my life. It doesn't work like that. We suffer just like everybody else does.
Yeah.
But we are called as Christians to identify with and to have compassion for those people who are suffering. And that might mean actually getting our hands very, very dirty at times.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the alleviation of suffering can involve putting my hand in my pocket, or it can mean going and living in a village in Nepal where there's an earthquake to help them put it right. and using my skills and my time and my effort to help them put it right. But whatever way God calls us to identify with it, we are to do that right then. Okay, so if a friend has just lost, a friend's mum's died or partner died or whatever, I'm called to I'm called to be with that person, to journey with them through their suffering.
Yeah, yeah.
Whether that's, as I said, a death of a parent or a partner, or whether it's an earthquake or whatever it happens to be. So first of all, the second thing we're called to do is to pray. So how does God deal with suffering? He asks us to pray. Okay? He asks us to ask God to sort the situation out. Whether that bringing peace into the situation or bringing a miracle into that situation or whatever it happens to be, we're called to pray.
Sure.
We intercede to the Father on behalf of the people that are suffering. We pray for them.
Yeah.
At the point of your suffering, it's sometimes really hard to pray, but we are called to pray for them and with them and stand in between. And then thirdly, we're to seek the Holy Spirit to help us to do signs and wonders. Okay? So I'm called to pray for people in their suffering, and I'm called to ask God to change it just like that. Okay, now that's the most difficult part. Okay, because we are now in between time between Jesus bringing the kingdom and the kingdom actually arriving. The Bible doesn't talk about it, but really what we're talking about is the kingdom's here but not yet.
Yeah.
So when Revelation comes, all suffering is dealt with. While we're here, some suffering is dealt with. So we can call on heaven to change people's situations, and we can call on heaven to create miracles, to do things, to change people's situations. And I'd like to see that more and more and more and more, but the truth is that no matter how many times I'm praying, I'm not going to get a 100% success rate, because the kingdom is here, but it's not fulfilled. It's not in its full, everything's not here right now.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So the way I deal with it is this. I'm going to identify with you, I'm going to pray for you, I'm going to ask God to change your situation, and I'm going to leave it with God the Father, who knows all things, for him to look after it.
Yeah.
Okay? Knowing that one day all that suffering is going to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Now, that's hard, because out of compassion, I'd like everybody's situation to be changed.
Sure, yeah.
But the truth is, while there's sin in the world, there will be issues around.
Mm-hmm. So there's a wrestle between needing to understand and having faith and choosing to accept in a way that we may never fully understand why a friend is suffering or why a family member is suffering. What would you say to people that are currently in that place of even suffering themselves?
I think that's a really hard question, because none of us want to suffer.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And what I hear a lot on the streets is, and I'm talking to people, is, well, if God cared about me or loved me, he would heal me. Or why did he allow my child to die?
Sure.
If God's a loving God, why doesn't he? Okay. Now, as a Christian, I can have faith that God has it all in control.
Yeah.
But if you're not a Christian, that's really difficult, because you don't have that faith that God's in control. However, my experience is that for the vast majority of times, just simply saying to somebody, look, I have no words. I can't explain this away. I can't give you the words of comfort that I know you need, but I am going to pray for you. Would that be okay? Majority of times, people are happy for you to do that.
Yeah.
And the problem with suffering is that sometimes, well, Psalm 107 puts it in this way: is there There are some people who are in suffering because of circumstance. It just happenstance.
Sure.
You know, they've got cancer because they've got cancer. Not because God is punishing them or because they've done something wrong or whatever. It's just that, you know what? I'm really sorry you have cancer. Some people are in situations because other people do things to them. They are victims of somebody else's cruelty or evil.
Yeah.
Some people are in a situation because of where they just happen to live. Just because of centuries of where their parents have lived. They happen to live in an area which has got earthquakes, or it's got tsunamis, or it's got whatever. Some people, sadly, make wrong choices. We all make wrong choices at one point or other.
Yeah.
Some wrong choices we make actually have significant consequences.
Yeah.
Which cause suffering. So it's part of what my answer to your question is this: it's helping me understand where is that person. Now, the interesting thing about Psalm 107 is that what it really says is that God is not interested in how you've got to where you are. God is interested in where you're going to go.
Yeah.
So, however you got into suffering, the Psalm says, when people pray, God answers. He comes running towards them.
Yeah.
Now, that might not be the immediate alleviation of suffering, but it is about bringing peace. It's about bringing aid. It's about bringing hope. It's about bringing faith. And God, it says that, I go back to what I said earlier, God identifies with people's suffering, no matter how they've got to where they've got to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and so it's equally for me. My issue is not to judge people for where they've got to. What God's asking me to do is to love them and care for them, identify with them, to empathise with them, to cry with them, to laugh with them, to walk that journey with them. You know, basically putting my arm around them and holding them through that suffering.
Yeah.
On their journey through it.
Yeah. Great, that's awesome. And just finally, what would you say about it being possible to be fruitful in suffering?
I think it's very possible to be fruitful in suffering. So you look at somebody like, there's hundreds of people you could point to. Johnny Erickson.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Young girl, diving accident, breaks her neck, paraplegic. But has been incredibly fruitful in both creative art, in sharing her faith, in empathising with people, incredibly fruitful.
Yeah, yeah.
Think of other people. Corrie ten Boom, who was a Jewish Christian I think she was Jewish, she's certainly a Christian in Holland in the Second World War, persecuted for her faith. Incredibly fruitful.
Wow, yeah.
There are hundreds and hundreds of people of faith who, because of their suffering, have actually been more fruitful than I'll ever be.
Sure.
Okay,
wow.
and so I guess what I'm saying is I admire those people more than they're the heroes of the faith for me. People who, through their adverse suffering, exhibit the love and grace and mercy of God beyond any measure that I could see in my life.
Wow.
And those are the people that I often want to be more like. Those are the people that are heroes to me, because despite their suffering, they see the goodness of God in their life and they respond to that. Now, that can be through prayer, it can be through faith, it can be through giving, it can be all sorts of areas.
Yeah.
There's bookshelves full of biographies of people another one would be Jim Elliot and Elizabeth Elliot. Jim Elliot, missionary, flies down from America into South America and lands with a tribe. He's sharing the gospel, and there's 4 of them, 4 missionaries, who are killed by those people.
Wow.
40, 50 years on, what we find is that the tribes that killed those missionaries saw the love and grace and mercy in Jim and his friends, and are now worshipping Jesus and loving him and being part of that.
Wow.
Now, suffering is not something anybody wants, but it can produce incredible fruitfulness in the kingdom of God.
Sure, that's great. Thank you very much, Paul. And if you have any questions about this interview or anything to do with the Christian faith, you can email us at pastoral@kingscc.org.